Well, good morning and welcome to The Well. If you haven't had a chance to meet, my name is Danny. I am the pastor here at our church and just excited and glad that you're here, that you're in worship with us today. And as Anne-Marie said, we are in the midst of a sermon series called Anticipating Advent, where we're talking about exactly that. Like, what does it look like to anticipate different things during this season? A season that can often blow by us, can go by quick. We can wish it away. We can try to get to the other end of it because it's wonderful, yet maybe stressful. And so to keep us on our toes a little bit and to anticipate a little bit of change, I want us to take just a moment. Like sometimes we ask questions during service. We haven't done that in a while, just as a chance to like warm us up. But I do want you just to take a chance, if you would, and kind of turn and introduce yourself to the people around you, maybe who you are, what your name is, how long you've been coming to the Well, and we'll come back together in just a second. But just take a moment, like introduce yourself to the folks around you, and we'll hop into the message here in just a second. Even though we didn't get a chance to ask a question today, I was talking with someone here from the Well about how we think it's really important for us to get a chance just to like meet other people. Like oftentimes we can come in and find our seat and leave, but we want to make sure that we create space on any given Sunday for you to maybe connect better with someone that you have just started to get a chance to know, but maybe connect with someone you've never talked to before. Because oftentimes similar stories bring us to this place, but we don't know how similar those stories are. And so we get a chance just to connect with others and say, like, we both found this place and what made it unique to us, and maybe what are we looking for God to do in and through us in that space as we find ourselves here. And so thank you for humoring me, taking just a little bit of time to chat with each other, and we'll dive in here now. And so today, as Anne-Marie said, we're talking about the idea of anticipating change. And change is something that I think Anne-Marie said very eloquently. Like, it's not something many of us love. Like, some of us, like, we're adept at handling change. Maybe some of us seek it out. Others of us, it's like something we avoid like the plague. We want to stay as far away from it as possible. And it's something that evokes different emotions in all of our life. And my first real interaction with like the personality difference in change, and obviously I've interacted with this other time. So the first time Annie, my wife, and I went on a date that was like out of town, like we went away, we were going to Herman. We had planned it, and like it's not like close. And so you have to like make a schedule and you have to do all these things. And my wife is someone that like, she makes a plan and she sticks to that plan, and when things start to shift, it can become unnerving. And so I got a call from my boss, my district superintendent for the denomination, the day before we were going to leave, and she was like, "Hey, we want to do a meeting with you and the church just to go over something." I was like, "Of course, why wouldn't we do that, right?" And so we were ready to like be there by 5:30 to be to Herman, and we're like, "Can we do the meeting at 4 o'clock?" I was like, "Heck yeah, let's put the meeting at 4 o'clock." And so Annie, she was wonderful. She like is very breezy. She goes through. So we get into the car and we're driving, and we didn't talk for like the first like hour of this ride. And I'm like, what did I do wrong here? And what I learned in this moment is like I was like very much like, oh, like we can change, we can do things, because I was the center of the moment, right? And so like I didn't like experience the change the same way she did, right? And so she's sitting and she's experiencing the change very differently. But I realized in that moment, like not only where you sit as you experience change drastically impacts how you receive it, but also like I kind of seek out change at certain points in my life. My wife would like very much like to make a plan and stick to that. And I think for many of us, like we fall in between that spectrum somewhere, right? Like change that some of us like we want to seek it out, others of us like we avoid it, but all of us, when unexpected change pops up, I think that's where like we get a little bit of tension, right? When it's something that we weren't planning for, or something that radically shifts our plans or our processes or all the things that we have going on, like this well-curated path for our life we've set out, like especially in that, when a plan gets dropped in and we have to take a fork in the road and everything changes, that's where it gets a little bit sticky. But I want to challenge us to at least consider this. You don't have to agree with me, but I would challenge you to at least consider this, is that change in us is often God's mechanism for change in the world. Like as change happens in us and God has unexpected changes in us, that's oftentimes the first step towards a mechanism for God's change, for further change in us, but for the spaces around us and for change in the world. And sometimes I think we feel that we're insignificant, or we feel that we're small, or we feel that changes are inconvenient at the best. And we don't often say like, hey, a change in my life or God stepping in and intersecting and shifting things could actually have really big impacts on the world. As I look into scripture and I look into other people's stories, like oftentimes these little micro changes or these changes and these interruptions in people's life that seem insignificant off the jump are actually God's mechanism for really radical change throughout the story of not only their lives, but other people's lives as well. And so to look at that, what I want to do is look at a story that maybe if you've been in church before, you've heard before. And if you've never been in church, you've maybe never heard the story. But if you've been in church, you've been like, I've never heard this as a Christmas story before, because it's not a Christmas story. But I do think it paves the way in many ways for the Christmas story. And it's the story of Moses and the burning bush, which is an amazing story of interruption and change in someone's life, and how that interruption and change actually is a mechanism for immense change culturally for all of God's people. And so if you don't know the story of Moses, you can find it in the book of Exodus. And so the Bible goes Genesis and then Exodus. So it's the second book of the Bible. And in Exodus chapter 3 is where we're going to be. But if you're like, I'm not a reader and I don't want to read it, you can go find a Blockbuster. You can rent the 1950s Charlton Heston classic, The Ten Commandments. You can go and watch that. Great movie. You can go rent that and watch that if you want to get to know the Ten Commandments, or get to know the book of Exodus a little bit better. But the story follows God's people. And so Genesis is kind of this creation story. And when we get into Exodus, God's people are in like slavery and captivity. The Israelites, they've gone under slavery under the Egyptian rule of the community. The Pharaoh, the king, is kind of oppressing them. And it's getting worse and worse. They're not just in slavery, but now they're getting like beat. And they're not just now getting beat, but they're getting put into like worse progressive manual labor. And like everything is getting to the point where it reaches kind of the height of the negativity of all of what's happening, where the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, says that all the boys in the community, all the Israelite boys, need to be put to death. Because he doesn't want them to grow up, he doesn't want them to cause an uprising, start an army, like challenge his rule. So we're going to put them all to death, and we're just going to nip this right now, we're going to get rid of them. And so Moses' mom saves Moses, sends him down this river. He's actually in a basket. He gets received by Pharaoh's daughter, raised by Pharaoh, and he kind of lives this like weird double life. Like he has influence and connection with the Egyptians, with that crew. He has connection, obviously, with his Israelite heritage. And he finds himself in this really interesting place where he's connected to the oppressor. He obviously has affinity and connection to the oppressed. He has a place of kind of opportunity and privilege among both crowds. But really, by and large, he's kind of just like a normal dude in many ways. Like he's just kind of a normal guy. And the scripture actually tells us in Exodus chapter 1, it tells us just how normal he is. So in Exodus 3, verse 1, it says, Moses was taking care of his flock for his father-in-law Jethro, working for your wife's dad. You get that, right? That's normal dude stuff. And he's doing other stuff, right? He's taking care of his flock. He's a goat herder like you and like me. Like he's just a normal dude. He's going about his life. He's doing normal people stuff, right? And like this passage is boring, right? Like he's working for his father-in-law, Midian's priest. He's leading his flock to the edge of the desert till he goes out to the mountain called Horeb. Like he's just doing all of this normal stuff. And this is an important thing. Like oftentimes, and I've said this before, like no piece of scripture is a throwaway. Like this author is trying to point out how ordinary and how normal his path was up to this point, to set up for what we're about to see next, right? Like, so he's going on this path, a path he's walked 100 times, a job he's done 1,000 times. He's done this thing. There's nothing really to be expected to be any different. And you've been in that situation before. Like you're on your commute to work, you're going to the grocery store, you're dropping kids off at school, you're going to the gym, you're doing your regular habit, and you kind of just zone out, right? Like you get into that zone and you're like, how did I get here? Like I don't remember driving here, right? That's kind of where he's at, right? He's going along his normal path, his normal job, something he's done thousands of times. And it's in the midst of that kind of ordinary moment that something truly extraordinary happens. We read about it in verse 2 and 3 of Exodus 3. It says, the Lord's messenger appeared to him, talking about Moses, in a flame of fire in the middle of a bush. Moses saw that the bush was in flames, but it didn't burn up. Then Moses said to himself, let me go check this out, this amazing sight, and find out why this bush isn't burning up. And so he sees this, right, like this. He's radically interrupted. He's walking on his normal path. Ordinary, extraordinary moment plops in the middle of it. This bush, it's not just on fire, but it's not burning up. That's a weird sight, right? Like I've never seen that happen before, but if I saw that, I would be like knocked on the ground, right? That's a weird thing to see. And the story actually continues to talk about, like, he has this further interaction with God where he realizes that this ordinary place is no longer ordinary, even to the point where it's turned into holy ground. And so he takes off his sandals and he's standing barefoot on this because it's holy ground. And that was kind of like a tradition of the time. As you walked into holy places, like, you wouldn't wear your shoes, you'd be barefoot in that. And so you'd be standing on holy ground. He realizes this ordinary place is shifted into holy ground. And I actually had a moment, when I first moved to St. Louis in 2015, I worked at a church that our services were held in a bar. And now the Well started in our brewery, and that's not a bar, right? So this was Humphrey's Bar down at St. Louis University, which is, yes, very seriously. It was famous for one thing and one thing only, which was penny pitcher night, where you would come on Thursdays and you would pay a penny for a pitcher. So like, it wasn't known for godliness and holiness, this place, right? And so we said we're gonna launch a new church service here Sunday nights. I got to become friends with the owners, and so they're like, of course you can do it. Like, we're slow on business. And I remember I was preaching one time, and it might have been on this passage actually, but I was preaching and one of my friends, Martin, came to the service. And he, in the midst of it, he's like wearing his chacos, and he's like realized it was like holy ground. He's like, man, like, God is here. So he took off his shoes and he's standing there, and we're like on the patio, and I'm watching this. I'm like, that's just some freaky toes. And like, we're like standing here, and I'm preaching. We get to the end of the service, and I'm like, hey, what was that all about, man? And he tells me, he's like, well, like, I was struck by what you said. Like, God really turns these unorthodox places into holy ground. I was like, I really dig that. I was like, there is like cigarette butts everywhere and like broken Bud Light bottles all over this patio, so that's kind of gross, and like, I maybe wouldn't stand on this barefoot. But that was kind of like the shift that's happening here for Moses, right? It's an area that you would never imagine to be holy, and it is radically transformed into this holy place, this holy ground, where Moses is standing in face-to-face with God in this burning bush that's on fire, but it's not burning up. And they have this conversation that continues in verses 7 and 8 of Exodus chapter 3. It says this. It says, God says, I've clearly seen my people oppressed in Egypt. I've heard their cry of injustice because of their slave masters. I know about their pain, and I've come down to rescue them from the Egyptians in order that I may take them out of the land and bring them up to a good and broad land, a land full of milk and honey, a place where the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites all live. And so what is God saying here? He's telling them, he's like, and I think this would be really comforting. Like, I see your pain. That's the first thing I see. Like, sometimes when we're in the midst of pain, we're like, does God even know that I'm in this pain? Like, he's very clear. Like, I see your pain, I feel your pain, and I get how much it hurts. Those are the first three things we really hear God say to Moses. Like, I see it, I feel it, and I get how hard this is. And that has to be like wonderful for Moses, right? To like feel like, man, God understands the hard things that are going on in my life. But he continues to say, like, I don't just see them, but I have a plan for what is happening. I have a plan for what's going on. And he continues actually to tell him in verse 10 what that plan is. He says, so get going, Moses. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And so Moses, he's in the midst of this, like, he sees this burning bush, he sees this thing. God says, I see your pain, I feel your pain, like, I know you guys are oppressed. I know you were a survivor of that oppression. Like, everything seems like it's going down and it's just burning and nothing is good, but I've seen your pain, I feel your pain, I've heard it, and I have a plan for you. And what I think is interesting in this is oftentimes we think in the midst of all of that if there's a problem, that God doesn't only not have a plan, but God might not have a plan for me. And God is very clear in this, that not only does God have a plan, but God has a plan for Moses. And I think for many of us in the midst of where we are, especially in this season, it can be hard for us to imagine God has a plan for us. But I would really challenge you to consider, to believe that God actually has a plan for you. That in the midst of like the hard parts of your life, or the great parts as well, but in the hard parts, we've talked about that, in the valleys, it's sometimes hard to believe that, right? But even in the midst of that valley, which is exactly where Moses is sitting, he sees first and foremost that God has a plan for me, and God has a plan for all of us. And that plan, as I said earlier, is a mechanism for greater hope that starts with the change in Moses. But Moses doesn't like receive this super well, right? Like, you imagine he goes from like super pumped, like God has a plan, God has seen us, God has heard us, and God is going to fix all these things. And then God is like, well, my plan is to use you, Moses. And he's like, well, I think you messed up here. Like, you carried the mail to the wrong person. Do you want me to move the bush and show it to someone else, right? Like, he's like, maybe you messed this up a little bit. Like, something is missing. And he actually says back to Pharaoh in verse 11, he says, who am I that I should go before Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt, right? Who am I? And I believe wholeheartedly you've said that to God, because I know I have, right? Like, there have been moments I'm face to face with what it seems like God's plan is for me, and it seems crystallized and it seems clear, and there's other times it seems more foggy, but I've asked myself time and time again, like, who am I to do this? Like, I've done this wrong, I've done that wrong, I can't do this. Like, Moses has his own laundry list, right? Like, he has his failures, he doesn't think he's a very articulate speaker, he doesn't think he's a very good leader. He has all of these things that he says, like, are his insecurities and his failures. And he says, like, well, who am I? Like, how am I going to be the one that accomplishes this? What I think is amazing is that God isn't like, okay, great, let me go find someone else who's better at these things. Or isn't like, you know what, I'm going to fix all of your insecurities. God doesn't do that either. God says, I'm actually going to use those to fulfill this plan. And I think God, for us, God uses our weakness to bring good news to us and to others. God uses our weaknesses, the areas we think are we're the most disqualified, to bring healing, hope, and good news to other people. And I think that is actually an amazing part of the Christmas story that we see woven through all of it. Like, all of these people, like Mary is too young, right? Joseph thinks they can't do anything because they're not married, right? Zachariah and Elizabeth, who are other members in the story, they're like, we're too old. Everyone feels like they're too something to be a part of it. And God uses that part of their story that they think is irredeemable or their insecurity or too far out. And God every time uses that, not just to bring good news to them, but bring good news to other people. And that's exactly what we see within this story with Moses as well. Like, his insecurities are actually the key to unlocking greater levels of hope and good news within this story. And so what I want to look at, though, like deeper within this story, because the story goes on and Moses kind of reluctantly, he pitches in and he goes a part of it, and he moves from who am I to like, all right, let's do this. And God continually kind of like kicks him along the journey in many ways, but they start going along this thing and get there. But I asked myself this week as I was reading, like, how did Moses get there? Like, that's a huge shift for many of us, right? When change is plopped into our life, especially a change that takes us from feeling insecure or like we can't do anything, like, how do we get ourselves to that point? And I think Moses would have had to ask himself two really good questions, and questions that I want us to kind of ask ourselves here today. Questions that I think that if we ask ourselves can actually help us live into this in a better way. And the first question that he had to have asked is like, what is God calling me to? Like, and I think many of us don't ask that question because we're like, well, the people that are called to things are pastors or church people. Like, the word calling seems very inaccessible. Many of us feel like we have like jobs, or we feel like we have like purposes, but oftentimes we avoid the word calling because it seems too churchy or religious. And I would argue that God is calling all of us to something. God is calling all of us with our gifts and our insecurities into something. And I've said this before, like, I think our calling, there's a quote that's attributed to this guy named Frederick Buechner, like that our calling is the intersection of our great passions and the world's great need. Like our skills, and I would even say our insecurities and the world's deep hunger, that's where our calling meets, when those things collide. And Moses would have had to ask that question, like, what is my calling? What is my purpose? What is my space in this for him to be able to be a part of that? And I would challenge you to ask, like, well, what are my skills? And what are my passions? What are the things that I'm good at? And also, what are the things that maybe make me nervous? And start to ask, like, what is the intersection of those things and the world's need, the well's need, the community's need? Like, where are the things that God has, like, stirred up a fire and a passion in me? Like, Moses had a passion for his people. Like, he had a passion for his people, and he had affinity and a connection to the oppressor, and God used the intersection of those things to bring something that only he could be a part of bringing. And I imagine for each and every one of us, the combination of those things is unique enough that God can use them for radical change within our community. And I would ask you to, like, challenge yourself to say, what is the intersection of those things for me? My passion, my skills, my gifts, and maybe even my insecurities, and the hunger and the need of the community that's around me. But the second question he asks is the question that I think, like, maybe we asked the first one. I don't think many of us asked the second one very well, which is, what is stopping me from saying yes to God? Like, many of us don't ask that question. We maybe know the answer, but we're like, I'm not going to ask it, because if I ask it, then I have to be aware of it, and then I'm aware of it, and then I have to do something about it, right? But I think many of us have that thing that we're afraid of asking, because if we name it, then we're like, well, then I have to navigate this. And for myself, like, I remember when I was growing up, so I'm a twin, I've mentioned that to you guys before, and if you know anything about being a twin or a sibling that's close in age, it's like competition at every level, right? Like, who can run faster? which was me, just saying. And I'm not very fast right now, but who could throw a ball harder? That was my brother. Who could jump higher? That was me. Like, we had like different things that we would compete about, but one thing, like my twin brother came out of the womb reading the encyclopedia. Like, this guy was a genius. And I was insecure about it from day one, right? And so I like put off reading for a long time. And I remember I got to like, and maybe I've told you guys a story before, I got to third grade and I got like called out in the middle of class for like faking reading. Like I should have been known. Like, I was in the reading club in the boiler room. Like, so I like obviously wasn't like very good at reading. Like, they found like the closet to put me in, right? So I wasn't very good at reading. But like I got called out. Like, I would memorize things, and like we got called to read out loud, and I had to read this thing, and like everyone's like, oh, so Danny just can't read. And I internalized like, well, Danny's an idiot. Danny's stupid, and I carry that with me for a long time in my life. I remember in high school, like I would not read aloud. In college, I would not read aloud. Like I'm amazed that God has put me in a profession and a calling that I write every day, and I read, and I do those things on a regular. Like, my life is like doing homework a lot of times, and I'm like blown away that God has put me in that space, right? But I remember when I moved to St. Louis in 2015, I worked at a church, and we had this thing called the Literacy Project, where we would go and we would tutor kids that were learning to read, and we were believing that if we could combat literacy, we could overcome issues of systemic racism and give people an opportunity to really overcome the areas in life that are oppressing them and holding them down. And I remember our missions director would come up to me and she'd be like, Danny, were you going to sign up to do the literacy project? I was like, Melissa, I'm definitely going to do that. And then I would like run to the other side of the office, right? And I had avoided this woman for 3.5 years without doing the literacy project. And then finally she found me and she's like, you're doing it this year, you have no option, and you have our kindergartner. I was like, well, that sucks. But then I did it. And what was amazing to me is God used this huge insecurity of mine that into my late 20s, I was still like terribly insecure about, right? And God used that to not only stir like a new passion in me, but also for a kid that was struggling with the same issues I was struggling with, was able to give that child an opportunity that he maybe would have never had. And I think when we begin to ask the question of like, what is stopping me, we start to get a greater glimpse of our insecurities and the things that are stopping us from embracing the call that God has for us. And then as we embrace that, we actually get to like lay a foundation and pave a road that helps others that come after us not have to navigate the same pains that we had to navigate. Like, our insecurities and our pains and our stories are actually what become the best groundwork for paving a new story of hope and good news that allows others' stories to have hope breathed into them. Like, for us, we feel like our pains are so big that we want to avoid them. And our pains are so big that we want to push them to the side and pretend like they don't exist. But just like they're a part of our calling, they actually become something that inspire hope and good news in other people as we allow them to be an integral part of that calling and that story. And so if I was recapping for us, I would want to remind us first and foremost that like, God does have a plan for you. Many of us, I think that's the hardest pill to swallow. Like, we're like, God has a plan for those people over there, or the good people, or the spiritual people, or the people that went to seminary. Like, God has a plan for you. God very much has a plan for you. And our job is to believe that and to act as if that is true and let God guide and see what that might look like. I would also encourage you to know that your insecurities don't negate you from your calling or your passion or what God has for you, but they will likely be an integral part of what that looks like. They're not something that get pushed to the side or ignored, but they actually become an integral part of revealing the hope and good news for not just yourself, because that story then becomes redeemed, but it actually helps other people's stories become redeemed as well, as they realize they're good enough and their insecurities don't disqualify them, and as your story is rewritten, theirs is as well. And then the last thing I would say is that we don't get the Christmas story without Moses. Like, he paved the way for so many other people to find hope and good news, right? And we see people after him do the same thing, right? These people full of insecurities and failures, from King David all the way up to Mary and Joseph. These stories of insecure people that paved the way through their insecurities and through their failures and through the areas that they feel like they're not good enough. They pave a story that actually allows God to do something. And it starts with them opening themselves up and anticipating the opportunity for a change in trajectory, a change in story, believing that God has a plan, that God can use them, and that God's interruption, as inconvenient as that might be the first step in actually revealing more parts of this Christmas story. And so for you and for me, my challenge this season would be like, how can we create space for interruption? This is a season that we blow by. And I've heard people say this before, and it always amazes me, and I probably said it too. Like, I just can't wait for the season to be over, right? Like it's supposed to be a season of joy and hope, but sometimes like when your in-laws come in town or whatever, it's like a season of like stress, and you're cooking and you're doing all these things, or like I gotta buy all these gifts, or like I've spent all my money, and it becomes all about things and all this stuff, and it can become a season that is not joyful and it's not life-giving. And my challenge for you would be to slow down and to anticipate the shift and the change that God might have for you in your life, to allow God's presence to come in and to receive that. And actually, as Moses was interrupted by this bush that was on fire, allow whatever that looks like for you to plop in the middle of your path and then start to inform the steps that you take after that. So that in mind, would you pray with me? God, I thank you so much that you do have the kindness and the goodness to intersect yourself into our stories and interrupt us. Like you don't just let us continue marching along our way, but you weave yourself into our stories, and you take the areas that we feel broken or insecure or not good enough. You take all the areas that we feel like, God, we just can't step in front of you with, and you turn those scary places into holy ground as we stand there with you. And so, God, I just ask that you would continue to speak truth into our lives and let us know that none of us are outside your power and story of redemption, and that actually the areas that we're most fearful of and the most insecure about can actually be the greatest pathway to living into the calling that you have for us. And so help us, God, receive that. Help us, God, learn how to ask what it might be that's stopping us from saying yes to you, so that we can release that and wholeheartedly say yes to you. Be with us now as we continue to worship, prepare our hearts to receive communion. Pray us all in Jesus' holy name. Amen.